Welcome to Lunch with the Lord. I'm Pastor Mark. We're in 1 Peter chapter 3, and we're continuing in verse 5 this lesson. But before we begin, Jeremiah chapter 15, verse 16. Thy words were found, and I did eat them. And thy word was unto me the joy and the rejoicing of my heart. Now, as we saw in the first part of verse 5, Peter here writes, and he says, For after this manner in the old time, the holy women also who trusted in God. And Peter here is bringing up holy women, women who have been set apart in the Old Testament as an example of women, of wives who have trusted in God. Like we saw the life of, we're going to see in verse 6, the life of Sarah. And also Leah, we talked last lesson. And other women who trusted God, Hannah and Rachel and Rebecca, other women who had their trust in God first. And so we continue on here, and he says, who trusted in God, adorned themselves, being in subjection unto their own husbands. And adorned here, the Greek word for adorned is kosmeo, and it means to arrange something. It means to put things in order, all right? Now, this Greek word kosmeo is in the imperfect tense. Why is that important? It's important because it means that they did this as a habit of life. So he says here in verse 5, they adorned themselves, being in subjection unto their own husbands. They didn't just do it one time and that was it. That would mean it would be in the perfect tense. But because this Greek word is in the imperfect tense, it means it was done continuously. It was not finished yet. So their adorning was a thing that was going on over and over, day by day. Okay? Now, what was it that these women were day by day adorning themselves with? And the answer is in the next phrase. All right? It says, adorn themselves, being in subjection. Being in subjection. So this is what they were adorning themselves with day by day. The adornment that these women were wearing in their souls was the adornment of subjection. All right? It's the same Greek word that we saw back in verse 1. Okay? In verse 1 he says, likewise, ye wives, be in subjection to your own husbands. Same Greek word as hupotasso, and it means to arrange under. It's a military term. It means to subject under, to arrange yourself under. All right? So, these holy women, these women who were set apart by God, who had a strong and daily hope in God, were submitted. They were subjected to their husbands as unto the Lord. All right? So, this is what Peter is saying here. Adorned themselves, being in subjection to their own husbands. So the adornment that these women were adorning themselves with in their soul was the adornment of a humble and subjected heart to their husbands. Now, verse 6. Even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters you are, as long as you do well, and are not afraid with any amazement. Now, Sarah here, Peter here brings up Sarah as one of the most recognized and distinguished wives of the Old Testament patriarchs as an example of submission to her husband. Sarah, listen, Sarah was never known for being an extravagant dresser or for doing anything that would draw attention to herself. But in all that she did, she honored her husband. Sarah, remember, Abraham was a Bedouin, and a Bedouin was a traveler. And as a Bedouin, you traveled and you lived in tents, and you moved around with your sheeps and goats or whatever you had, finding land for them to feed on. And you, as a Bedouin, you didn't live in a stable house for many years. Abraham and Sarah were considered Bedouins, and they traveled. And therefore, it wasn't like Sarah lived in a city and she could adorn her outside body with all this jewelry and clothes and everything. But Bedouins weren't known for dressing extravagantly. And so her adorning was an inward adorning, okay? She submitted to Abraham as her husband, okay? She left Ur of the Chaldees. She didn't nag or complain Abraham, but by faith, submitting to Abraham as her husband and as head of the house. So Sarah leaves Ur of the Chaldees with her husband Abraham and becomes this Bedouin wife with Abraham and travels down through the promised land and on into Egypt and then out of Egypt and so on and so forth. And you never see where she complains or nags him or anything, but she humbly submitted herself to Abraham as her husband and as the head of the house. Every Jewish woman who would hear this letter from Peter would have good knowledge of the life and the honor of Sarah and of all that she represents to being a godly wife of Abraham. And this is what Peter is trying to bring up here to these believing Jewish wives, that as Sarah submitted to Abraham, and she trusted, although, yes, she was Abraham's wife, and she submitted to him, but she submitted primarily to God. Her primary honor and subjection was unto God. And then because she submitted her heart and her life to God first, it made it easier for her to submit to her husband Abraham, because she trusted that God would take care of everything, even her husband. She trusted that God would move and guide her husband. All right? So he says in verse 6, even as Sarah, what did she do? She obeyed Abraham. Now, this Greek word for obeyed here is hupakuo, and hupa means under, and kuo comes from the Greek word akuo, and it means to hear. So it means to hear under. We've seen this Greek word in previous lessons that we've had, that hupakuo, to obey, obedience, okay? To submit or to obey someone because of what you were told. And this is what we mean by hupakuo. Obedience, as I've said before, obedience always begins and ends with what you hear. And obedience to God always begins and ends with hearing the Word of God. Always hearing the Word of God. This is why to say that you are a believer and that you obey God means that you obey what you hear. This is why it says, faith comes by hearing, and hearing by what? The Word of God. the Word of God, the Bible. So to be an obedient Christian means you have to obey the Bible. If you do not obey the Bible, you are not considered an obedient Christian. You may be obedient to something else, but you're not obedient to God. To truly be an obedient Christian means to hear and to obey the Word of God. Okay? Because hupakuo means to obey what you've heard. Now, the original Greek construction of this word means that Sarah had been obeying Abraham over a long period of time. Not talking about a one-time obedience or a short-time obedience, okay? It's the same thing. It's in verse 6. Even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, all right? It's talking, because back in verse 5 it says here, who adorned themselves being in subjection unto their own husbands, even as Sarah obeyed Abraham. Again, it's in the imperfect tense. How did she was what? She was continuously adorning herself. So her continuous adorning means she was continuously obeying. Not a one-time obey, but a continuous obeying. All right? And then it says, calling him Lord. Now, because of the Greek construction of this word, obeyed, we also apply to Sarah this continual action of Sarah calling Abraham Lord. It wasn't a one-time calling him Lord. It was she did this continuously in the imperfect tense. All right? Everything goes back to that imperfect tense. Lord here refers to one who is the head of the house, the main ruler of the house. It does not mean that she was a bond slave or someone for Abraham to rule over. Remember, Sarah is Abraham's helpmeet. God chose her for Abraham, and Abraham is to give her great respect as one who has been chosen by God to be his wife. And this is important. She called him Lord, but out of respect for his office as the head of the household. Doesn't mean that Abraham was to lord his relationship over Sarah and now she becomes his bond slave. No, it doesn't mean that kind of lording. No, it means she called him Lord because she realizes that Abraham is the head of the house as the husband, and she will honor him as the head. She knows he's not perfect. She knows that he makes mistakes. She knows that he has faults too. But also she realizes that Abraham is the husband. He is the head of the home, and she will submit to God as she will submit to God and to God's order in the family that the husband is the head of the home. And she will then therefore submit to Abraham as the head. And she calls him Lord, not because she's a servant or a slave. No, she is his wife. God specifically chose Sarah for Abraham, and Abraham is to honor her and to respect her as God's chosen wife, God's chosen helpmeet for him. She's a helpmeet. She's not a slave. She's a helpmeet. All right, we're going to continue in the rest of this verse next lesson. Until then, walk with the Lord. I know he walks with you.